and auto transcription. Brilliant. Okay, great. Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. We must be getting near the end of these seminar series now. We've been going since September, so yeah, thanks for sticking around and continuing to join us. We're joined today by Dr. Rihab Khalid from the University of Cambridge. She's an Isaac Newton Trust Research Fellow at Lucy Cavendish College. And she also completed her PhD in Cambridge a couple of years ago in 2020. She's currently working as an interdisciplinary researcher in sustainable energy consumption and demand management, focusing on socio-technical approaches. And she's committed to a problem-driven research to tackle societal challenges and to improve energy efficiency and sufficiency in architectural and urban spaces in the global south. We're also joined by Maiss Razem, who is also based at Cambridge. She's a PhD candidate and ISDB scholar in the architecture department. And she received her BA bachelor's degree in architecture from Jordan and her MA in architecture from Virginia Tech. She's worked in design practice and taught at several universities since, and her research focuses on unearthing intersections between materiality and actors in constructing energy demand in Jordanian residential buildings, investigating especially how cooling practices are shaped from the three perspectives of market, architects, and building users. So really kind of relevant expertise, and I believe you're presenting to us on a recent paper that you co-authored together. Really looking forward to this, and yeah, thank you again so much for joining us. I'll hand over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that wonderful introduction. So let me just start the presentation now. So are you able to see it? Yeah, okay.
Perfect. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. So thank you everyone for coming today to this session. So the title of our talk today is The Nexus of Gendered Practices, Energy and Space Use, a comparative study of middle class housing in Pakistan and Jordan. And just to give you a quick overview of the presentation, so we will start with the premise and background to the research, followed by the key research objectives and the theoretical frames that guided the work. Then we will look at our case studies before we move on to the findings. And in the end, we're just going to quickly look at some of the main reflections and implications that came out of the work.
Thank you, Rihab. And it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. So presenting this talk, it's based on a paper that we recently published in the Journal of Energy Research and Social Science. And we focus on this nexus for two reasons, mainly. First of all, when we talk about the intersections between gendered practices, energy, and space use, it is usually under-researched, especially if we're talking about the Global South. The second reason why we are focusing on this topic is that even if we are encountering research that talks about gender dynamics in the Global South, they usually focus on rural settlements and low-income areas, which provides less attention on the experiences of urban middle-class women. And so, why is this focus important? We look at, of course, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and it rightly addresses and acknowledges the importance of SDG number 5, which is gender equality and the importance of empowering women. And we see that this SDG and this goal is undeniably linked with other goals as well. And so in order for us to achieve this kind of sustainable transition, we have to acknowledge that we need to address women's energy needs. And this is done by actually talking about and discussing how, unfortunately, gender inequality persists overall. And you know, these statistics we're probably all familiar with, but it is presented in these kinds of responsibilities that women bear when it comes to doing nearly 3 times as much unpaid care and domestic work as men. In addition, we look at the global south and the potential for 80% of the population expansion, and even 2/3 of energy demand is projected to increase by 2040. And this is coupled with the fact that we live in a landscape where energy planning is gender neutral. However, gender neutrality can lead to gender blindness. And in addressing this in a rapidly urbanizing global south, and in meeting the projected energy demand, we have to think about what women need and how a gendered lens can help in this. And so our aims and objectives from this paper were, in fact, to investigate women's differential energy and space use in domestic practices and how they used technologies and spaces, especially in contemporary housing, looking at the energy transitions that the context of Jordan and Pakistan are going through, while exploring the intersectional differences that occur within and between middle-class women in both of these contexts.
So our research was grounded on 3 main theoretical frames for this study. The first of which is social practice theory and how it represents energy consumption as an outcome of what people do, and presents social order as a constituent of interconnected practices and material arrangements. We also build on some of the more contemporary work in practice theory that explores gender as a constituent of practice performance, inscribed in various practice elements, social structures that continue to sustain gender relations. Secondly, we took an intersectional approach to gender, moving beyond a binary to focus on the intersections between gender and other social categories of difference, such as income, class, ethnicity, education, and geographical location, and how these come to define power relations. And finally, we draw on Barbara Welter and Betty Friedan's conceptions of separate spheres in female domesticity, in that men and women occupy separate spheres in society, which is based on a distinct gender divide between private and public spaces. And this closely links to the division of labor and work allocation between men and women, which is supported by social rules about the organization of living space. Now, in most Muslim societies, including Pakistan and Jordan, women and family life occupy a central position, and the house is considered to be the domain of women, with varying degrees of privacy, seclusion, and female segregation observed. So we see ideologies like parda, which is seclusion in Pakistan, and sharaf, which is honor in Jordan, being materially manifested through the spatial and architectural arrangements.
And to introduce the context, which some of you might not be familiar with, however, we kind of included some statistics just to see how these contexts compare when it comes to domestic electricity consumption and the gender considerations in policy and some data. And we found similarities which presented an interesting case for such comparison to be conducted. Which is in fact that these 2 countries have similarities when it comes to the climate and the cultural aspects. They both represent a Muslim majority population, and they are lower middle income emerging economies. In addition, they are part of what is called, or what Naila Kabir calls, the extreme belt of patriarchy. And you find it manifesting in patrilineal relations, wherein it is linked to understandings of family, kinship, and gender, which is also manifested in how women have limited access to the public sphere. And if we look at both countries have this kind of colonial and post-colonial histories that are materially manifested, especially if we're looking at these housing arrangements, which you can see following this modernist plan and being influenced by Western images. So in the case of Pakistan, for example, and similarly in Jordan, you find this reflected into open plans, wherein the living space is open to other spaces, the incorporation of increased glazing areas, large windows, which is the case with Jordan as well. And you find this, constant kind of contesting ideologies of trying to reconcile modernity with tradition within these houses and their designs that are coupled with changing socio-cultural norms in both countries. They are influenced by building regulations that are prescriptive in nature and follow a kind of like a grid iron layout system that disadvantages the use of outdoor spaces and actually restricts the areas of peripheral leftover space, as we can see in the case of Pakistan here, for example. Kind of also restraining the construction heights, the floor area ratios, and setback dimensions. This is kind of like materially manifested in these spaces. And we see this in the housing typologies differences between the two contexts. For example, in Pakistan, it is mainly a single family housing, which is inhabited by usually 5 to 10 occupants. And they are usually also, like some of them are joint family systems, which is an interesting case that kind of departs from the norm in Jordan. In Jordan, we have 2 building typologies. One that is single family villas, as you can see here from the lower images on the right. And then you find the multifamily housing typology, which is inhabited by many families in 4 to 5 stories of a building.
So our case study for the project included 15 households from Lahore and 13 from Amman. And we did semi-structured qualitative interviews, which were combined with walkthrough tours in Lahore and video diaries in Amman. This was because when data was collected in Amman, there were pandemic restrictions in place. We also triangulated our data with document analysis of house plans and building regulations, as well as energy consumption data from electricity bills. So coming to the findings now. So we present our findings on the intersections of gender, energy, and space by focusing on the 3 main themes that emerged from the analysis. The first of these is gendered space use in practice performance. Now, the gendering of space in Lahore and Amman is deeply entrenched in historical, cultural, and religiously derived constructs of female domesticity and segregation. And in our analysis, we found that contemporary indoor spatial arrangements often tend to conflict with women's need for privacy and segregation, which then becomes contingent on material elements like curtains, shutters, and windows, which are implicated in the gendering of domestic space.
And it is interesting to see this manifesting in this case in Jordan, where you see materials such as curtains, shutters, and windows are interacted with in a gendered manner. And it reflects this sense of the importance of privacy in ordering the domestic practices of everyday life. Here, Tala shares that she keeps her windows closed and shutters and the curtains because it is exposed to the neighbor's house, as we can see here, where the window is directly overlooking the interior of the house and her bedroom even. And so she decided to purchase an air conditioning unit because of this deprivation from ventilation, from keeping these windows and shutters closed all the time. And it kind of solved this problem, as we can see here, where cooling was provided by this unit. And however, we see this kind of interaction with these material elements in a way that leads to this energy intensive practices by keeping the lights on, for example, when the darkness of is subtended because of the closed windows and shutters, and also because of the operation of AC most of the time.
Similarly, in Lahore, we see Ghazala saying, "I want to have my privacy when I'm in my bedroom. I like that the curtains remain drawn always. I don't feel comfortable if neighbors and house staff can see inside." But it's not just windows that determine women's energy and space use. Other contemporary features of these houses, such as these open planned living room spaces, they not only tend to exacerbate cooling loads, but also constrain some religious women's free access due to their observance of stringent parda. For example, this was seen in the case of Amman, who didn't have a separate drawing room in her house. And so whenever any male acquaintances would visit, she would find herself imprisoned in her room, to the extent that she even had to sometimes use the telephone to give instructions to her kitchen staff, just because she was physically prevented from doing so. We also found that similar constraints related to privacy were also observed in women's outdoor space use. Now, over time, traditional housing patterns that included elements like private central courtyards, staggered outdoor, inward-facing windows, and inclusive urban planning have been replaced by modernist and Western replicas of standards for building densities, gridiron street layouts, outward-oriented housing layouts, and other such building codes and planning regulations that exhibit gender oversights, thus marginalizing women's energy and energy needs and space use.
Which is presented in this case in Jordan, where Dania shares that when performing the practice of laundering and air drying clothes, she feels that, as quoted from her, saying, "There are eyes on me." So her use of the roof is restricted in a way that she feels exposed to the neighboring buildings. And this is especially compounded by the fact that she is surrounded by taller buildings, which are increasingly becoming predominant in the planning of this housing typology, that is multi-store family buildings that are invading the privacy of the use of outdoor spaces, such as roof space, kitchen balcony, and terraces.
And similar concerns were also observed in the detached housing in Lahore, where, for example, restrictions on the heights of boundary walls, as well as of those in roof terraces, these parapets, mean that such spaces are left exposed and so lack privacy for use by women. For example, as Aisha said, that even when she wants to go and sit outside, she cannot because of this lack of privacy. Now here we want to highlight that even within our limited sample, we could clearly see that women's energy and space use was not homogeneous, and there were clear intersectional differences between women's spatial access and use. And these depended on a number of different factors. Of course, the most important one being cultural and religious norms of parda and sharf.
So in the example of Tulin, who wears a hijab, she has to cover herself whenever she goes outside, when she uses the balcony or the roof, because she feels exposed to the neighbors. And here we see the importance of privacy manifesting as well, and how the cultural and religious norms kind of orient this type of behavior and restricted use of the space. However, we cannot really, think about cultural and religious norms as the main determining factors in the uses of spaces, where Jannah shares that, changing her marital status from being married until when she separated from her husband, the control she had and the agency she exercised on using the space, completely different. And she shares that, you know, her husband used to tell her to close the windows most of the time, and he would take control. However, the situation differed, wherein after she separated and when the ex-husband would visit the kids, as she shares, he tells me to close the windows. I tell him, it is not your business. This is my house.
And so factors like women's age, marital status, and position in the household become important in their agency. Now, in the case of Pakistan, we see this differential access become especially apparent under the prevailing joint family system, where the mother-in-law is considered to be in a position of authority as the main female household manager. So even when contemporary housing trends provide separate living quarters for the daughter-in-law and her family, which can include the provision of a separate kitchen, what we find is that cooking and preparing meals still remains a joint practice, which is governed by the mother-in-law. So our analysis showed that many such second kitchens in joint family households remained and effectively inaccessible to the younger women for whom they were designed. And here you can actually see one of these kitchens, which is being used more for storage than for any other purpose. And this actually corroborates previous studies, which show that women's autonomy in South Asia depends on socio-cultural factors that include family structure and co-residence with the mother-in-law. Now, all of these examples that we have shown help to reveal the gendered oversights in the male-dominated sectors of energy, housing, and planning. However, this isn't to say that under such constraints, women just became victims of poor design, or that they remain passive consumers of energy and space. On the contrary, our analysis showed significant evidence of what Pink describes as the feminine resistance to masculine framing. And we saw evidence of this in how women subverted the architect's intentions by, for example, coming up with ingenious ways of using windows, by covering windows with cloth and bamboo blinds, by putting up sheds, by converting bedrooms into living rooms, by putting up partitions in these open plan living spaces, and even in one case, reducing the size of window openings to decrease the air conditioning load. So clearly we see that women can and do practice agency in their space use. But the point we want to make here is that such masculine framings mean that women often perform their everyday practices by negotiating between comfort, convenience, and consumption.
And the second theme that emerged from our analysis was how technologies are used in gendered ways in the performance of everyday domestic practices. And we see here how women's household energy consumption is directly implicated in the technologies used in practice performance. And this is in line with previous studies that talk about how technologies serve as social constructs that become both a source and a consequence of gender relations. And so in our analysis, this gendering of technologies became apparent in two instances. The first instance is when disruption was experienced, which affected women more so in Lahore because of the fact that electricity had an intermittent supply. And in Jordan, even though it was a continuous supply without that much disruption, but moments where the electricity was weak was also experienced. And how these technologies are used manifested in the example of Jamila, where, for example, all her routines and everyday practices were coordinated and scheduled around electricity hours because of the load shedding times, and how she kind of assumed this role of management and multitasking and adjusting to the situation. In addition, you find Hanan in Jordan, who recently switched from a gas stove into an induction hob. And suddenly when she kind of used this new technology in her home, she experienced weak electricity, and the hob would just turn off on its own most of the times, which kind of, speaks to the fact that these peak hours are actually experienced and, mostly burden the woman in how these domestic practices are conducted. And how, for example, this disruption in electricity kind of did not allow her to use the electric dryer and kind of forced her to dry clothes and air dry it and using the terrace. And we find these examples kind of attesting to the fact that women are most vulnerable in experiencing these disruptions, and how they kind of experience the irregularities in the system, and how policy should think about who is more affected by this, which is women more than men. And this is another example of how policies that aim for increasing solar water heater ownership by 25% in 2030 is just kind of isolated from the gendered use of this technology in the domestic sphere. So we find the example of Faris sharing how his wife feels that it is very difficult to use hot water from the solar water heater because it is not compatible with using the water pressure pump. And so they canceled out the solar water heaters and they rely on the electric heater because it is easier for her to perform laundering, washing the dishes. And it kind of attests also to the intermingling and the interconnections between these technologies and how they reflect on the gendered use of these everyday practices, which policy needs to address as well.
Now, the second factor in the gendering of technologies was evidenced in relation to energy conservation behavior. And our study actually is very much in line with previous studies, which show that women generally tend to show greater tendencies towards energy saving, especially when it comes to comfort-related practices. So, for example, in Lahore, some of the older housewives didn't turn on the air conditioning during the daytime in the absence of their male members of the family and children. Similarly, in the case of Amman, women like Jannah felt that they were not justified in using the air conditioning just for themselves alone, but only when all the family and the kids were there. Now, moving on to the third theme of our analysis, which is women's agency in the gendering of domestic practices. So we have shown that women are primarily responsible for most of the efficient and flexible demand management of energy technologies at home. And so women act as the strategic change agents for domestic practices. And while their agency is dependent on the spatial arrangements, as we have shown, it is also dependent on socio-cultural norms, such as the household composition and their changing role within the domestic sphere.
And we see in the example of Raya here, how when changing her role from being a wife into a mother of a recently born daughter, how she became more agentive in exercising control on the use of air conditioning unit, wherein she pushed her husband not to use or turn on the air conditioning. And he was fine with it because the daughter was in very early age. However, when her daughter became older, she kind of lost the control to her husband, who kind of turned on the air conditioning unit. And so you find this kind of switch in agency when the status of women changes from being a recent mother. And this is, kind of reflects into this kind of intersectional approach into how women share different kinds of agency. And there are negotiations that happen between labor costs and energy costs, and they are conflicting when it comes to negotiating these power dynamics between women who assume the role of household managers and women who are housemaids.
So for example, in Lahore, in most middle and upper class households, practices such as those of cleaning, washing, and laundering are often delegated to the housemaids, even in households with women who identify as housewives, changing their tradition from one of being of actually performing household practices to that of managing and delegating routine tasks. And while not all women would willingly take on this role, many women, many middle-class women in Lahore choose to remain at home. And so being a housewife is not seen as inherently disempowering. And many low-income women actually prefer to work as housemaids in these high-income homes rather than in the public sphere, which allows both these women, the housewives as well as the housemaids, to uphold the notions of parda in the separation of spheres. Now, of course, this then has consequences for how practices are performed, but also it has implications for energy and space use. So for example, in Ghazala's case, her laundering practices are very complex, where part of the laundry is sent out to the nearby washerman, part of it is washed at home in the machine, and the rest is delegated to the housemaid. In Halima's case, she has actually put off replacing her old semi-automatic washing machine with a newer automatic one, because she doesn't want to lose her housemaid, who essentially relies on the part of her income that comes from washing to be able to continue working here. And so there's quite a complex set of negotiations that is happening between, juggling between labor-intensive and energy-intensive practices, especially in joint family households.
And this is kind of contrasted with the case of Jordan, because joint family households are not the norm anymore in Jordan. In fact, it has been a trend since the 1980s that people are moving into single family homes wherein they're inclined to nuclear family kind of composition households. And this, in fact, kind of speaks to the lack of support system that it also reflects into how housemaid are on the decline. Like hiring housemaids are not that common anymore. And we see here that it's probably not an economic issue sometimes in the case of Jannah, so that in her case, she talks about how when she hired a housemaid, her electricity bills became much higher, and how when she used to direct her and kind of, instruct her not to consume that much electricity, the husband, as she is quoted here, would turn on me and side with the maid. And it is interesting to see how she lost control, and the way that she would gain power back is by not hiring a housemaid even, and basically bearing the brunt of the house chores even more. And so we see these negotiations of energy consuming practices are largely contingent on freeing time, which has been especially experienced by single mothers and working women. And the fact that Maya here shares how, because she's a working mother and she doesn't have that much free time, she purchased a lot of clothes. She bought a lot of clothes in order for her to avoid frequent washing. And it is way in rescheduling her practices and reducing the load as much as possible. In the case of Tulin here, because she's also a working mother and a single mother, she doesn't have the time to air dry clothes or even hand wash some of the dishes. And so she relies heavily on the electric appliances such as the electric dryer and the dishwasher. And this speaks really to the transformative potential of technologies and freeing the time of these working women and allowing their access to the public sphere. But it also comes at the cost of being very energy intensive. And coming to the reflections now, so our comparative analysis shows an overall gendering of domestic spaces, technology, and demand management practices. But it also shows intersectional differences in how practices are performed. It shows how different women navigate the separation of spheres differently in the two contexts. So for instance, as we have seen from the examples shown, in nuclear households in Amman, single mothers and working women's everyday practices are largely dependent on energy demand and efficiency of time-saving technologies. Whereas energy consumption of extended households in Lahore depend on women homeowners' household management and multitasking skills, where their routines are organized around load shedding schedules, and they enter into negotiations with female help. Our analysis also shows the complex role that technologies play in the gendering of domestic practices. Household energy technologies can be liberating for certain women. So for example, middle-class working women, but not others like housemaids. And in certain situations, when domestic service is no longer available, but not others in terms of energy saving. And in both cases, we see that technologies related to practices like cleaning and cooking have not really resulted in transforming gender relations, as these practices are still predominantly considered women's work. However, analysis also shows that this role cannot be understood as inherently one of oppression, as women did find ways and means to exercise control and agency within and through domestic practices. Thirdly, our study further corroborates the need to move beyond hierarchical dualisms. For example, between modernity and tradition, public and private, global and local, north and south, etc. So clearly, Lahore and Amman, although similar in certain climatic and cultural factors, have evolved into their own unique socio-spatial arrangements. But more than that, there are also intersectional differences and distributions within Lahore and Amman as well, which need to be accounted for.
And in the end, we just wanted to highlight some of the key implications of the research. So our study shows the need to move beyond gender neutral and gender binary practices and policies. So current gender initiatives in energy policies and debates either focus on gender binaries or on female-headed households, but fail to address the differential access and needs of different groups of women, even within the household, and those that are most marginalized in the society. And if we look at housing policies, then they continue to be gender neutral. And so we are far from achieving what Hayden imagined as the non-sexist city. And so what this means is that we need localized solutions for improved equity and sustainability that takes account of historically and socio-culturally contingent nature of women's energy practices. So for example, this could include interventions that can design more private indoor and outdoor spaces for more religious women, or they could present alternatives that provide more energy efficient or community-based solutions for working women. And so we believe that by using a gendered practice theoretical approach, we have been able to show the complex and interconnected nexus of gendered practices, energy, and space use, which shows that housing and energy are interlinked within broader socio-spatial systems, such as those of patriarchy and also the separation of spheres. And so these can only be challenged by taking an integrated approach. For example, by designing interventions in house and asset ownership laws, by producing more inclusive urban planning and building regulations, and by framing policies for women's improved participation in the energy and planning sector, to name a few. So with this, we come to the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for your time. Welcome your questions and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. That was fantastic. I can't find the emoji. There we go. Round of applause. Really, really fascinating. And once again, just another amazing talk. Does anybody want to kick off with a question? I've got several, but if people would like to ask questions, please either post them in the chat or raise your hand and I'll come to you. So maybe we've got a few people typing at the moment. I'll kick things off. Really, sorry, I'm trying to order my thoughts here. Yeah, absolutely, Anushri. So my question here was first of all, you describing kind of opportunity, like kind of forms of resistance or female attempts to change to change these or respond to these designs. I'm just interested here in other contexts. We often talk about kind of, oh, actually what we need is more women in the decision-making process, right? Within energy companies and so on, higher up, higher up the chain effectively. Whereas what's been described mainly in this talk as being kind of household responses to these kind of planning designs and decisions. I was just wondering whether you'd be able to reflect or provide a little bit of reflection on the extent to which that which it might be possible to incorporate women into decision-making processes, and how applicable that is in these two different contexts of Jordan and Pakistan. It may be the case that it's absolutely not something that is foreseeable in the near future, but yeah, just interested.
Yeah.
So thank you, Peter, for that question. Yeah, I think, I mean, definitely this idea of getting more women to participate in decision-making at every level, really, not just, within the domestic sphere, but also in the public sphere is important. I mean, the reason behind this is that, so definitely when we're talking about, urban planning policy, to understand how women might navigate the city differently than men is very clear. So as Sylvia Chant has said, that cities are often designed by men for men. And it's easier for us to see why women find it difficult to navigate the public sphere. But I think, the reason why we wrote this paper was because what we saw was that it's not just the public sphere, which is, obviously made for men, but even spaces within the domestic sphere, which are, dominantly supposed to be for women, often don't translate into making their lives easier because they're not designed that way. And again, because they are mostly designed by men. So it is still a male-dominated sector, housing, when we're talking about architects. The majority of architects in Pakistan and Jordan are still men. Urban planning is still male-dominated. So essentially, we should begin by, yes, addressing women's greater participation in that sphere, but also it's about understanding women's needs better. So we need to have better gender disaggregated data to see how women are using electricity, what kind of access do they actually have when the connection is provided to the household. Because we know that even when that connection is there, that doesn't end their, the differential access. Women in the house will have a very different access to that electricity than men will, because of the kind of practices, because of those inherent gender roles. And so, it's difficult to say, but a lot of it is so integrated. So when you talk about change, where do you start? You can start with the urban planning, you can start with talking to architects, but it's so integrated in the socio-cultural norms, the patriarchal system, the colonial systems, that unless you address those, so unless you address women's position in the society more generally, how do you start to maybe transform gender relations themselves to make that change? That is, I think, the more difficult question. Do you want to add to that, Maiss?
Well, briefly, so I interviewed many architects as part of one of the samples, probably not in this paper, but in my PhD work. And I saw that, the answers differed from architects who were women than men when asking them about, what kind of spaces they usually focus on when it comes to their clients. And you see this difference in the response from women architects who cared for example, providing spaces that, preserve this sense of privacy, and, thinking about, their domestic practices and how they are conducted, not having the laundry on an upper floor where women will have to go up and down the stairs most of the time. You find these kind of nuances more understood from female practitioners. And this would be, most crucially reflected when women actually become in positions of power, wherein they have this kind of gendered understanding of how, spaces and, the performance of these domestic practices are just, so vivid in their mindset that they can produce this change and this agency when becoming, powerful enough to decide on these matters in planning and in housing and even in energy policies. It just, speaks to these dynamics of every day that are missed out when, men are in charge.
I mean, you absolutely addressed my question there, and that was about as robust an answer as I could possibly have hoped for. So thanks. We've got so Anushka, I know I said that I'd come to you in a second, but Pascal is building directly on top of that. So if you don't mind, I'll just kind of quickly turn to Pascal's question. Pascal, do you want to read it out, or shall I?
Okay, I'll read it out. Yes, I just wondered if you had encountered any or heard about any kind of cases of open resistance or quiet open resistance to this kind of purdah, because I have been surprised to meet women that actually do it. And usually it actually impacts the men, and it puts the men a little bit in their place, and they start kind of going along with it because they don't have much of a choice. So I just wondered about that, because it really surprised me that even in sort of really socially conservative settings in certain countries, I still found these women here and there.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So it would, I think I would want to address the idea of resistance with purdah and with, Islam more generally as well, because I feel like, it really depends on how these women perceive purdah. So some of them do embrace it. So it's a part of their identity. It's a part of how they live. And it forms, for them, it is a form of agency as well. And that I'll get back to that in a minute. But yes, for some women, and especially I think it's difficult because the way that these spaces are configured makes it difficult for them to uphold these ideas of purdah, which, they might not be against. So the problem really for them is not the purdah, but the way that the spaces are configured. And we see this very easily handled when we look at some of the older vernacular buildings. So for example, buildings that were designed, houses more than a century ago, were developed on patterns which suited women's needs much more. We see the use of private indoor courtyards, which were very conducive to women. So they were able to go outside freely because they were completely private spaces. They were able to use them in a very effective way. They actually became the center of activity for them. And they were, it was really for them, it was this idea of how spaces were able to, they were able to use these spaces while upholding their own identities of purdah and their own, desire for haya, for modesty as well. But of course, this isn't to say that there aren't women who do observe purdah or who don't show that resistance. So for example, from what we saw was that the women who were more religious, for example, those who did wear hijab, found it difficult to use those outdoor spaces because they would have to cover themselves every time they just, stepped out of the house. But a lot of women don't. for them, wearing a hijab does not form a part of their own religious understandings. And so they are perfectly fine going out and using these spaces. A lot of the housemaids actually, those peripheral outdoor spaces, they do use them to do the washing, in spite of the fact that they don't offer that privacy. So they do show that resistance in a way, but I think it is very much negotiated. And the idea for me is really to say that it's not parda or religion that is the culprit, the problem. It's really the way that the spaces have been configured and how religion is kind of injected onto the society in specific ways and not others that becomes the problem. I hope I've been able to answer that question.
Yes, that was quite interesting, because I'm also kind of interested in the fact that as Western researchers, there's a little bit of a tendency that we can exoticize like other countries, and that's a little bit unfair on those other countries, I think, because from your talk, I'm seeing similar things, for instance, happened even here in Finland, in Helsinki, where we have public saunas, for instance, which are usually gender differentiated.
Okay.
But some, for instance, have there've been cases where they come out. The people using them actually stand on the street. So the men will stand in the street, and if you're lucky, they will have a towel on. And then there's a space for the women hidden behind, so that the women can have more privacy, for instance, from the men, not from the passers-by, but from the men that are there. So I find that it's a problem. Which is kind of similar question, but it's not framed in terms of religion. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. Traveling through the city and making the most of the spaces, because they are. I mean, we can't get away from the fact that they are designed with the default, which is men. It's the adult male that they're designed for. I was actually reading this very intriguing book. Maybe you've read it as well, Leslie Kern's Feminist City. And she talks about how, she, especially coming from a Western perspective, she had never really thought about these differences before she became a mother. So when she was pregnant, and then when she became a mother with a stroller, did she realize how much the city was against her and how difficult it became for her just to move about in the same streets, in the same area, but now everything was like, it was from a completely different embodied perspective. Yeah, so I mean, there's certainly this idea of gendered spaces and gendered roles. It transpires in different ways in the West, but clearly there are still those distinctions there.
And just to follow up with your discussion, Rihab, is that we kind of like have to ask ourselves, what spaces make women most comfortable? Where do they feel at ease, and without the need to actually establish this sense of privacy in a way that restricts their access to certain spaces. And it's this kind of question that is unfortunately not really investigated enough in our part of the world, where you find this male gaze, directing policy and the conception of outdoor spaces and indoor spaces as well, and even buffer spaces, the ones that are semi-private and semi-public, like balconies, roofs, terraces. In one of the examples that I encountered in one of the cases, one of the participants said she really appreciated how the neighboring building positioned the windows so they are not directly viewing her windows, where they were shifted. So it was kind of like an intention from the architect and the designer to shift these windows in order for not to have this direct vision line. And it's kind of like these simple design decisions that are just lacking and like are considered an oversight when it comes to what makes women comfortable inside their houses as well.
Great, thank you. Should we move to Anushree then? Are you happy to turn your microphone on, Anushree?
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to really thank you for that brilliant presentation. I genuinely enjoyed listening to all the stories and all the anecdotes of the women that you'd interviewed or spoken to. And I mean, I'm coming from a perspective where, like, okay, so as part of the project that I'm working on, we also intend to speak to women in particular and look at their energy practices. But so the questions that you're asking are slightly different. But we do intend to sort of, so me and one of my colleagues, she was also supposed to join us. She's not here, but I'm also sort of asking some of these questions on her behalf. So she's looking at the change in energy consumption practices at the household level during summer months. And some of my questions as part of the project are to look at how cooling technologies in particular are gendered, and what are their sort of like usage patterns with respect to women's thermal realities and experiences at the level of the household and potentially outside the home as well, but with a specific focus on the home. So I think my question is more of a methods question, where I was looking at all the pictures that you included in the slides, and so, like, of the pictures of the kitchens and like of the living rooms, etc. So what I guess I'm mostly wondering is that of, like, how do you navigate and negotiate access to people's homes, which are like, and since you've all both been really attentive to questions of privacy and like other sort of cultural practices around it, how do you as researchers navigate those terrains, like, in a field which is already sort of like really already throwing those questions right at you? So that's one question, but also you just sort of think of like the discussion, the previous discussion also sort of made me think about reading sort of spatial layouts and floor plans and other sort of architectural blueprints, etc., for residential spaces for with an eye for socio-cultural norms and specific kinds of gendered practices that are maybe specific to a region or a city. And I'm sure there are some of those in the households that we will also probably encounter. But one of the things that I maybe wanted to mention in response to some of the examples that you quoted about there being some kind of segregation in to accommodate like practices of Pradha, and like, so the community, the gated society that I live in Hyderabad has almost all the households here have a space for a temple of sorts within the home, and that's how it's been demarcated within the floor plan. And I'm somewhat like connecting that to this idea of like the way that these communities or these houses are sold in the real estate markets is that of a neoliberal kind of modernity, and in fact like a globalized high-tech kind of a modernity, which is sort of the perception of the city that I live in. So like to me, those connections were sort of interesting to then think of. Also, if that's something that you encountered in your work as well, like was there a connection to the broader conception of the city in the way that these houses were, like conceptualized as residential spaces? And like to why I'm interested in that also is because the current political climate in India sort of really lends to that kind of an association where a globalized modernity is equivalent to a Hindu modernity to some extent as well. And there have always been undercurrents of that in India, I guess. But yeah, like I'm curious what the situation looks like for the countries or the cities that you've studied. So 2 questions, I guess. Hope that's not.
Thank you so much. Really good questions. Yeah. I think Maiss is very well placed to talk about the methods because she used video diaries at a time when, due to the pandemic restrictions, going in person to do the interviews was just not an option. So tell us about your experience.
Yeah, interestingly, I was also looking at cooling practices. So it kind of, and I employed this method of asking participants to share video diaries, which was very helpful in the way that they became agentive, and they had that choice of sharing whatever they felt comfortable sharing visually and even discursively as well. So interestingly, because of this granted agency and these participants actually providing these video diaries, they shared videos that documented, spaces that a researcher would not probably have access to in even normal days, not necessarily the pandemic, such as, for example, the bathroom or bedrooms, master bedroom, all sorts of video diaries were collected from these participants in these kind of culturally restricted spaces. And also in times that are not accessible to researchers, like morning, daytime, afternoon, and even nighttime. One of the participants actually shared a video diary where she woke up at 4 a.m., 4 in the morning, and she kind of recorded the video and sent it to me. So it was, these kinds of methods that you give the control back to the participant and allow them to share these experiences, where you bypass the issue or the problematic issue of privacy altogether. And so they shared, their uses of how they opened and closed the windows, how they, expected their behaviors to, with other household dynamics and other household members, and how, the use of the window was kind of explained while they recorded the video, in addition to when and what times they operated the air conditioning on. So it was very helpful using the video diaries in my case, which I would recommend definitely if you are concerned, or if anybody is concerned about the issue of privacy, especially in contexts where it is very crucial.
Yeah, I did want to ask, did they have trouble in what equipment did they use to capture? I mean, would that be a hindrance for someone to record a video, do you think?
Yeah, so some participants were really enthusiastic about the idea and they actually used a professional camera to record. However, the majority who were women, actually, from the sample of people I approached, they used just their mobile. They kind of recorded the videos and just sent it to me by an app. And so the main focus was that it is doable. You don't need to be very tech savvy in order to record these videos. Just use your mobile and send it to me whenever. And of course, they were presented with an information sheet and consent sheet, and also ethical issues of not to record children, for example. And they had the option of sharing their videos with me. And if they don't want to continue, because that project was throughout the period from April until September, and some of them did not continue all throughout that period of time, which was fine as well. It was just that they knew that they had that option as well. So it's kind of like a method that was creative in a way, that produced very rich visual data and audio and informative and actually instantaneous while they performed their practices. And that was kind of the merit of using this method in helping to see how practices are performed when they are performed.
Yeah, and I mean, there have been some people who have done ethnographies as well. So Sarah Higginson, I remember she wrote a paper where she spent, I think, within people's houses, but of course that can be quite difficult. So I would suggest that with the kind of qualitative work that you have to do, where you have to get such detailed information about people's lives, it does really matter how you connect with them. And so you do definitely need to develop that trust. And what I found was that, it took me quite a while to get to that point where, I would have initial meetings with them. I would show them who I was, and, I would interact with them for some time before they were kind of willing to show me around the house, for instance. So it does require a bit of extra effort, definitely. Right. So the second question that you had, I'm hoping that I've been able to understand it correctly. So I mean, I would say that yes, definitely. In the case of Lahore, what you see is that in the last 50 years or so, there has been quite a shift in the way that houses are being designed, which is reflected in, you know, these, in a way, it's even the imitation of what I would call, you know, those Western ideas, the idea of, you know, achieving that American dream is very strong, whether it's through advertisements, through, you know, people's desires, and it translates into urban planning and housing development as well. So most of the housing development that has taken place in Lahore has been targeted to a certain class, you know, the upper income classes, and has been modeled around very specific ideas of what their contemporary life needs to look like, which is very westernized, you know, very much based on nuclear family households. And that is why we see, you know, so a lot of the urban planning follow that, you know, grid iron planned urban layouts with those detached housing. And you see these effects of globalized effects of, you know, what kind of materials are being used, the kind of spaces that are being asked for by the clients. And I had some interviews with architects as well, who were designing for, you know, the upper classes, the upper middle class and the upper class. And they would say that, you know, over time, they see that where 30 years ago, most of the clients would bring in, you know, these photographs of American houses for the architects to build their own houses. The shift that he sees is that from a Western perspective, it's now becoming more of an international perspective. And so he talked about how some of his clients now bring images from their recent trip to Malaysia and from Indonesia, and they have these, you know, examples of houses and spaces from those spaces as well now, which they wanted to get translated into their own designs. So definitely there is this impact of globalization in terms of, especially I would say in terms of how the shift has been towards more large open planned living spaces, the open planned kitchen, which I mean does not work. Let's be honest, it does not work in our culture, where the type of cooking that we have is just not designed for open planned kitchens, but people still ask for it. And the way they compensate is that they have another dirty kitchen or wet kitchen in the back where the actual cooking is done and where all the dishes are washed for the entire, you know, family. So it's, you know, you see a lot of these spaces which are meant more for aesthetics than for actual function, which I think is one of the most strongest aspects. And then the large glass windows. So again, they dominate the housing landscape right now. Everyone wants to have those huge glass windows, which they don't work for the climate. They don't work for the culture. A lot of the times what I found in these houses was that, you know, people would have lots of things. They would have various blinds, curtains, green cloth outside. I mean, even to the extent that they put up mattresses in front of the windows to keep the heat out. I mean, they're not being used for the purpose that they're intended for, because they don't offer privacy, because they result in so much heat gain, but they're being designed and everyone still asks for them. So it's, you know, it really has to do with, you know, what kind of ideologies we have, aspirations we have as well in these countries, which is still very much, you know, Western focused. Okay, so there's a follow-up.
That's it. So Anushree got a follow-up question there about the method, saying, was there a particular kind of format or template that you followed for asking participants to create the video diaries? And is there a reference that could perhaps be used and shared with her teammates? I've also got a kind of I've got a cat that's come and say hello. I've got a follow-up question there as well around kind of what did men think about this study, and about were they okay? Were they okay about you know, you asking their family members to do videos, diaries, and so on? So yeah, a few more questions on method.
Yeah, okay, so thank you, Anushi, for this question. I have multiple sources, actually. If you want I can definitely send it to you, but I might need your email for that. Anyways, the template that was used was mainly guided by earlier work from a project that my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, Dr. Minna Sunika Blanc, worked on. And so she guided me in asking the right questions and actually informing them on what aspects that are, should be avoided when it comes to recording these videos. So the ethical concerns of recording a video was largely guided by my supervisor, who she provided resources for that, which I can share with you, Anushri, definitely. When it came to the template, what I faced is that many of the participants did not understand what to do. Like when they recorded the first video, they told me, do you mean like this? Are you sure this is what you meant? And so this kind of back and forth communication, I felt that I needed to provide them with a sample video that they would look at, where it provided the information in a much more intelligible way. So a sample video was shared with them from one of the participants who agreed to share her video diaries that were compatible with the information I wanted to be conveyed. Sharing the time, the hour, exactly which elements were used, material elements, because my focus was on the materiality, and giving them the freedom to share wherever. So I kind of canvassed throughout that sample of a video, canvassed all spaces in order for them to see that you can film your kitchen while cooking and opening the window and ventilating the house as much as you want. And so the template was in a written kind of information sheet that were sent to them, but also a link for a video sample, if they did not understand what was needed, was also sent to them as well, to make it more understandable. So it was kind of, let's say, a little bit improvised, where you would find this kind of engagement with the participants, and is information really understood in a mutual manner. And you kind of also reframe what you want. And sometimes they would share videos that I didn't even imagine were possible. They would film, they would record, animals and birds who nested on the windowsill and saying, well, I opened this window in order for me to feed the bird. It's, these kinds of surprising findings where an interaction with the window kind of revealed so many uses that as a researcher, I would not even have imagined. So it's a back and forth kind of recursive, information exchange between you and the participants. And it's not really that rigid of a template where, you find this kind of freedom in shaping it.
And you want to answer Peter's question about what the men's response was?
So it was interesting that, well, from the participants, I only had 2 men sharing videos. The others, who were around 17, were women. I told them that, your husbands can film the videos, but then again, it speaks to the fact that women culturally stay at home most, and they are the ones that are in control of using these material elements more, and kind of it reflects in the performance of these gendered practices. So women were not filmed, men were not filmed, and women even tried to avoid recording their reflection on windows and glass. And you see this aspect of privacy and, this embodied sense of self being mirrored literally in the way they recorded and, kind of choreographed their movement in these video diaries. So it, the shift was more on women recording their videos than men.
And also, I think, this also speaks to the fact that, what I observed is that women are generally the ones who are physically interacting with their houses more as well. So in my case, what I found was that in terms of window opening and closing, in a lot of the houses, this was being done by women and not by the men. And it seems like women, obviously they do spend more time, but they have more of an, embodied interactions with the materiality of the house is much stronger than with men as well. And that was my perception though.
Yeah, and for Anushi, I guess also it was important probably to mention to you that after having the videos diaries shared with me, I followed up with a sample of these participants with interviews, with in-depth interviews, because some of the aspects that I had questions about needed more elaboration on the timing, on the frequency, and again, on who decides, on the frequencies of using certain appliances, using the air conditioning, and just zooming into these household dynamics that were more shared in an interview format than video diary. But again, the video diary was basically the entryway of accessing this kind of information for later elaboration.
Thanks, both of you. The really fascinating stuff here. And it speaks quite nicely to some other work that I was doing last year, a couple of years ago, trying to join up kind of these ideas of demand, like what constitutes demand, how is demand made, and how do you actually go about measuring that or kind of understanding that. So I think it's really, really interesting. I've got another question here, unless anybody wants to chip in and ask one. Please do post questions in the chat or raise your hand. We've got about 6 minutes left, so maybe a couple more questions in here. I'm really fascinated by this idea of kind of the relationship between people and the grid, right? Because and how this kind of knowledge of the grid and its rhythms and its capacities has developed, and kind of what that means really for people's lives. And I think you did a really good job at kind of talking through how people interface with the grid. And I wonder, there's two parts to this question. So there's one is kind of how has that knowledge developed, and kind of what are there particular characteristics of that knowledge that kind of on that relationship, that are there particular emotions, effects, relationships with the grid? Do you feel that people are frustrated with it, that people just accept it, or kind of, I'm intrigued as to, it's almost like the grid feels alive in a way that the grid, say here in the UK, largely we just expect it, that the infrastructure is totally backgrounded, right? Because it just works. And then the second part to the question is, we've heard about, so you've given examples here around how the grid, or how women respond to the fluctuations of the grid in their own actions. So in many ways, how users respond to changes in supply. I wonder, and this may be totally beyond your realm of expertise, but I wondered whether you got any experience here of how the grid has responded to these forms of demand, and like, how have these practices of different kinds influenced demand, and has there been any, has it created any kind of need for response from the grid? Now, I understand totally that that's not your area of research, so I don't expect you to have a robust answer to that, but just intrigued, basically. So yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for the questions. And yes, I mean, this idea, very early on when I started my PhD, it was at that time when I started looking at demand, and I would read a lot of the papers, obviously from the West, from the perspective of UK and other Eurocentric studies, and there was always this idea that energy is invisible. It's always, it's never there. Nobody thinks about it, which just did not speak to my own experiences and of everyone that I knew in my life. For us, it was like, constant part, a very dominant part of our everyday routines was thinking about the energy, thinking about when it will be available, when it wouldn't be available. So it was a very visible and integral part of our daily lives because it wasn't always there. So its absence really became the source of it really being present. And this visibility of energy, it translates into everything. So this whole intermittency has been going on for, I think, more than 2 decades now. And so I can say that for a lot of people, it's just what they know. For younger people, it's, we've been living with this since always. And for a lot of people, it is frustrating. Obviously it is. There's most people are resigned to it because you can't really do much about it unless you can afford to do so. So one of the things that has been happening more recently is, over the last few decades, what happened was that for those who could afford to override the system, you could, the market was proliferated with these battery backup systems, which are called UPS, so uninterrupted power supply, which is essentially a battery which stores electricity when it is there and then gives it back to you at 50% the efficiency. So they are highly inefficient, but they were the only choice. And so whoever could afford to do so would override the system. So the wealthier you were, the bigger your UPS system was in the house, which meant that you could have, more fans and lights and equipment and appliances on, which meant that your life was more continuous rather than, intermittent. And then there were generators, so petrol and diesel generators. And, I cannot tell you the amount of noise and air pollution that resulted from these. I mean, you were unlucky if your neighbor had a diesel generator because it was so noisy and it would just pollute the entire environment. But for them, I mean, it was their only solution, right? And now, more recently, since solar panels have become more common, so now what we see is that solar panels have again proliferated the market. Now we can't talk about the quality control, which isn't there. And so the efficiency of these panels, the materials, those are questionable, but they are now the in factor for overcoming the grid. So people are starting to, who can afford to do so, want to disconnect from the grid in the way that they want to have that luxury of continuous supply through solar panels. So renewable energy is now becoming that social status symbol for, maintaining an air conditioner throughout the day, having that comfort of performing your everyday practices, without being disrupted. So so it's that dual purpose. So it's, in a way, renewable energy is not, it's not the form of efficiency that you would think it was. It means more energy is consumed more continuously, right? So there is that. What the response of the grid has been, I mean, it's interesting. I don't think that there has been much of a response because the problem really is with that gap in supply and demand. So every time that there is this gap, which is dominated by evening peak time loads, they cut off parts of the city to ensure that there isn't enough supply for the entire city. And most of this, unfortunately, even isn't to do with how much energy is being generated. It's to do with the problems of the distribution and transmission, which are based on this very old and it's a system which is now, it needs renovation, it needs upgrading, and there's just not enough economic power and maybe even labor and even skills to get that done. So most of this has to do with the outdated supply system, right? So the policy does look at that and has been talking about improving the transmission and distribution. There is much more idea of private-public partnerships as well to overcome those, governmental barriers as well to improve the supply. But the focus is still very much on the supply rather than the demand. There's this huge disconnect. So it's all about supply, improving generation, but nothing about reducing or understanding demand. So there is this gap which seriously needs to be addressed. For example, I mean, just the idea that for women, they have to synchronize their practices just to be able to work. So this time response aspect of the grid, it can only be done when understanding everyday practices, which is missing.
Can I follow up? Just with a small point, is the fact that, just focusing on the shift, that we need to shift away from this individualist understanding of energy consumption, which is reflected in energy policy, where the aim is to try to change individual behaviors in order for them to reduce energy consumption. And moving away from this engineering perspective of predict and provide, understanding how demand increases, thus improving the supply and enlarging the provision systems. So it's trying to shift away from this and thinking about load shifting of demand management services, wherein they zoom in into practices, not this individualist focus on this kind of homogenized category that departs from the dynamics and the rhythm and synchronicity of everyday practices. And again, gender comes to this focus as well.
Honestly, this is just so fascinating. And I could sit here and ask you questions all afternoon, but we are 5 minutes past the scheduled end point. Let me just say again, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for a fantastic talk and just some fantastically insightful responses to these questions. I'm certainly going to be thinking about this for days to come. So and I look forward to kind of seeing you both and asking you questions about your future research. I know, looking from the chat, there's several people here who are likely to be getting in touch fairly soon as well. So just thanks again, both of you. And just a quick shout out about our next talk. So we've got another skipped week this time because of the strike in the UK. So the next one is on the 11th of March with Rehana Ferdu from Oxford Brookes University. Rehana's fabulous. I did my PhD with her. She's doing a talk on energy access and gender inequality in off-grid homes in Bangladesh. And again, I've linked the link for you to go and register for that talk higher up in the chat. So without much more ado, you've got a few thanks in the chat. So thank you again, another round of applause. And yeah, we look forward to hearing from you both soon. Oh yes, and the recording for this chat, for this conversation, will be made available next week. Okay, so it usually takes us a few days to get it uploaded, but keep an eye out for our on our Twitter accounts, on our email accounts, and even on our YouTube account, and you definitely won't miss it. So yeah, thank you both.
Thank you so much, Peter, for having us. It was a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having you all.
Yeah, lovely. Okay, take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.